thanks very much, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to stand away from that because it's getting my eyes. I have to go at like 7:30, so yeah, we'll do half an hour me talking, half an hour questions, if that's okay with everyone. And yeah, I'll just talk a little bit about what is in the book and whether or not what I've written about has any continuing relevance at our particular political conjuncture. I hope that it does, but time will tell. So I guess, yeah, I mean, you know, the book is basically a Marxist analysis of the growing influence of finance over the British economy over the last 40 years, which is kind of discussed under the heading of this idea of financialisation. And I think there are a couple of important things to understand about what makes it a Marxist analysis and why that's an important stepping off point, especially if any of you are doing economics in here. A lot of the ways that I talk about the economy will be very different and probably quite unfamiliar. And so starting from the point of a Marxist analysis means centering the relationships between different classes in society. There's an understanding that capitalist societies are composed of different classes, predominantly the people who own the stuff that we need to produce things, and the people who are forced to sell their labour power in order to subsist. The vast majority of people obviously falling into the latter category. It's also a perspective that focuses on production. Now, for any of you who do economics, you'll be used to this idea that the firm is a black box. We don't look at what goes on inside of the firm because neoclassical economists focus predominantly, if not solely, on the realm of exchange. Again, you know, this stuff about classes doesn't come in. It's utility maximising, rational agents coming up against one another in markets and exchanging goods, services, products, and labour with one another on kind of, you know, relatively equal, we assume, terms. So the Marxist analysis again starts with production, with what goes on in the firm, which is seen as this black box. And Marx, when he's talking about this in Capital, famously spends a long time talking about exchange and then says, oh, but actually, if we want to understand any of this, we have to go into the firm. We have to actually look at what's going on inside the firm. And he does that amazingly in Volume 1 of Capital when he talks about the incredible just horrors that were going on in many of the kind of industrial manufacturing plants, particularly in the UK at that time, and the abuses of labour that were taking place. And finally, it has to be historical. So if you're studying neoclassical economics at the moment, then you will be used to things being static, and you are actually told that the analysis that you're being given is static. You will probably learn dynamic, stochastic, general equilibrium theory, which is looking at very small changes in a fairly simple system that is historically bounded. There are specific time periods that you're looking at with a specific number of agents who interact with one another in fairly predictable ways. But Marxist analysis is historical. It looks at the development of capitalism, it looks at the emergence of capitalism, how capitalism develops, and the problems and contradictions that emerge in capitalist systems. And it's also an analysis that centres conflict between those different classes and how that generates problems and ultimately crises. So those are kind of important things to keep in mind if you have, as I did, studied neoclassical economics in university, because it's a completely different stepping off point. And it's really one, I think, that sheds light on a lot of the stuff that remains hidden when we talk about the economy, and particularly the power relations that exist between different groups, and particularly between workers and bosses, which is not something that we're used to talking about. It's not something that's fashionable to talk about in economics, in the media, wherever. And yeah, I think that's why it's kind of important to adopt this lens alongside other lenses. And you know, this is the problem with economics teaching in lots of different parts of the country, is that you only learn one frame. Maybe in second or third year you might be taught a bit of feminist economics or development studies or whatever, but you don't really learn to adopt a completely different way of looking at the world, which is why actually doing that and looking at things from a Marxist perspective or a post-Keynesian perspective or, you know, a feminist perspective or whatever can actually allow you to understand the economy much better and each of those theories much better as well. So yeah, I'm going to give you the perspective that I lay out in my book, and it's really a kind of analysis of British capitalism that centres on the history of the last 40 years and analyses that through the balance of power between different class forces. And so, yeah, again, bearing in mind that this is a Marxist analysis, it looks at the emergence of different forms of capitalism, kind of historically bounded manifestations of British capitalism, the crises that those generate, and then how that creates a process of change. And so what I mean by that is that you can really look at, historians among you will be familiar with the idea of the kind of post-war consensus, right? This is a period after the Second World War in Britain where, which is often referred to as the golden age of capitalism. You have relatively high growth rates, you have low levels of inequality, living standards are rising, growth is relatively high, and that kind of conjuncture it marks a very particular historical point. And before that, at the kind of the turn of the century, you had a very different model of capitalism. You had the kind of laissez-faire model, which was highly internationalised. It was marked by a kind of wave of globalisation, marked by very high levels of inequality, a kind of focus on free trade amongst particular sections of the political class, and ultimately that ends in a period of crisis. And that crisis obviously is marked by 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And out of that crisis is where the post-war consensus comes from, right? You have this institutional model, there's a crisis that emerges from it, you have a period of instability, and out of that period of instability emerges a new model. Equally, the post-war consensus in the 1970s starts to exhibit signs of strain. You get the winter of discontent, you get a bailout from the IMF, all sorts of kind of political turmoil. And out of that emerges a new settlement. And this is the settlement that I analyse in the book, which is the era of what I call finance-led growth. And these changes, they don't just kind of happen. They are driven by, firstly, changes in technology, in the way that the international economy works, in kind of broad shifts in the economy that shift the balance of power between class forces, but also, crucially, by politics. So again, you can think of these different settlements as kind of institutionalising different balances of power between capital and labour. You know, when you had the period of laissez-faire, you had, no basic democratic representation for organised labour. It was very much a policy that was driven by capital, and one section of capital in particular, the kind of internationalist orientated segment. In the post-war period, that golden age of capitalism was underpinned by a much greater role in the state for organised labour. And you had a much more equal balance of power between labour and capital, between bosses and workers during this period. Often that kind of manifests itself as a kind of corporatist relationship where you had the state, workers and bosses working together to kind of decide who gets what. The state would step in to promote full employment if there were high levels of unemployment. And the unions had quite a significant role in economic life. All of these things kind of underpinned that model of high growth that was seen in the post-war period, that kind of golden age of capitalism. And similar sorts of trends prevailed throughout the world, and particularly in the US. And then I look in the book at why that model broke down. And again, thinking back to our fundamental premises, if this institutional settlement was based on a balance of power between capital and labour, that balance of power was nevertheless marked by conflict, because all capitalist societies are marked by conflict. And most of the time that was kind of under the surface, because the unions would bargain with the bosses and the state would help, and the unions would say, we want this amount, and bosses would say, no, you can have that amount, and the state would then parcel it up and make sure that everyone was broadly happy. And if they weren't broadly happy, there would be a strike, but it would ultimately be kind of dealt with through the proper channels. It was during the 1970s that settlement started to break down. You started to see that latent conflict becoming overt. You had a huge increase in strike action, which massively impacted the economy. You had all sorts of other problems that were related to the global economy. So there was a big balance of payments problem. there was associated with this kind of new competition higher competition from new capitalist countries or developing capitalist countries from around the world, and you started to see the kind of decline of various sections of British industry and also heightened industrial conflict. And then there was the oil price spike in 1973, which massively pushes up inflation. And what this does is very interesting, because again, if we're thinking about this in kind of neoclassical economic terms, then, you know, you've got a bit of inflation. That means you have to hike up interest rates and make sure that the unions aren't demanding too much in the form of wage increases. But if you're looking at it from a Marxist perspective, you can see, okay, so this rise in inflation is going to do something to the balance of power between capital and labour. It's going to start to shift that relationship a little bit. And it does, because when that inflation comes in, the bosses have to keep costs down if they're going to compete, but workers have to demand wage increases in line with inflation if they're going to survive. So suddenly that's where a lot of that conflict comes from. That latent conflict can't be managed anymore. It can't be managed by the state. It can't be managed by that relationship. So it kind of explodes onto the national scene, and eventually you get the winter of discontent, and the 3-day week, where basically, you know, not enough energy is being produced by the coal miners, which means that, you know, basically the power can only stay on for a couple of days a week. And that was the power that organised labour once had in the UK. It was literally able to shut the country down if it didn't get wage increases that the workers had demanded. And this was kind of the beginning of the end for the post-war consensus, partly because of those kind of contingent factors around the oil price spike, but also there had been long-term trends that I look at in the book as well towards globalisation. So, you know, the offshoring of jobs to the global south, to financialisation. So the growth of kind of international capital markets, the removal of restrictions on capital mobility, growth of big financial centres like the City and Wall Street, and various other things, technological change as well, that had started to shift at a global level that balance of power again. You started to see big multinational corporations that could say, well, if I have to pay workers too much, then I'm just going to leave, right? Obviously, that shifts that balance of power between those two classes quite substantially. And in the UK, this crisis is met with a very particular response that actually dramatically accelerates those underlying trends, particularly the trends towards financialisation. Because in 1979, again, that point of massive crisis, the winter of discontent, there's been a bailout from the IMF, the country's basically at a standstill, and Margaret Thatcher comes to power. And Margaret Thatcher comes to power promising a kind of radical shake-up of the British economy. It's premised upon a couple of different things. Firstly, the idea is that we need to move as an economy towards a modern, services-based, clean economy that isn't this old, traditional, inefficient, manufacturing and mining-based economy. That's one of her kind of set of ideologies. The other one is that the role of government is that of a good housewife. The role of the Prime Minister is a good housewife. She has to make sure the state is not spending more than it is earning. And finally, that the unions were not the real representatives of working people, and they're actually getting in the way of the efficiency of markets. Obviously, this was the real driving force behind Thatcher ideology, was that if markets didn't exist, you needed to create them. That, incidentally, is this kind of ideology of neoliberalism, which many people will tell you doesn't have a definition. It actually does. David Harvey's definition of it is the view that human well-being can be best maximised by through the market mechanism and the creation of markets where they don't exist by the state. And so this kind of set of ideologies associated with a particular set of discourses and arguments that were made during that election, you can look at it on the one hand as reflecting changes in, if you're a neoclassical economist, you say, well, by that point, everyone had realised that monetarism was the right way to go, and that you needed central bank independence. You needed to make sure you're controlling the money supply, that the government wasn't spending too much, that you weren't allowing inflation to run away because of over-demanding unions. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is to say British capitalism was in crisis, and the ruling class decided that we needed a massive break with the previous model that was again associated with the balance of power between capital and labour, and we needed a model that was going to consolidate the power of capital, and particularly international financial capital, which again, because of those global trends, was growing in influence anyway. And so all of these things kind of act as cover. You know, they have legitimacy and academic legitimacy in their own right, but in many ways they act as a kind of a cover over what is basically class war from above. Bernie Sanders has a really good quote that I like, which is that if there's going to be class war in this country, it's about time the working class won it, which I think points to the fact that you know, the 1980s in particular was really a time of class war from above. It was a time where the particular section of capital used the institutions of the state to dramatically transform the way the economy worked. And so, associated with all these different things, with this new ideology, with neoliberalism, with you know, that set of arguments that she made, was a big set of changes to the regulation of British capitalism and to its you know, comparative advantage to basically British political economy. So that she came in and she immediately removed restrictions on capital mobility. So money can move in and out of the country at will. She deregulates the banking system and she demutualizes the building societies, which has the effect of basically allowing banks to create huge amounts more credit than they otherwise would have, than they had before, where there were exchange credit controls, that existed. She privatizes a huge number of state assets. Obviously, you know, you have the big state utility companies, you know, British Rail, British Gas, BT, etc. But the biggest privatisation she undertakes is the privatisation of social housing. That's still the biggest privatisation that's ever been undertaken by any government in terms of the value of the assets that were sold off. Privatisation was a big thing. Deregulation, cut taxes. There was the big bang in the City of London where kind of overnight a bunch of kind of what were called anti-competitive restrictions on the way that the city worked were removed, and the city is able to kind of take up its role as the centre for some forms of international finance. And as this happens, obviously those trends that we'd seen already towards deindustrialisation, towards the shrinking of the manufacturing sector, are consolidated and cemented. And the financial sector starts to take a much bigger role in the British economy. In the late 1970s, manufacturing was about 30% of the economy, and finance was about 5%. And by the financial crisis, the financial sector had doubled in size, and we had experienced the most rapid deindustrialisation, when you look at both output and jobs, of any advanced economy when it came to manufacturing jobs. And this was associated with a bunch of different trends. This was really an overt strategy by Thatcher and actually by successive governments after her, to shift the way that the British economy worked, to privilege certain groups over others. And the first thing, you know, aside from all those changes to the kind of regulation of British capitalism, the first thing she does when she comes into power is kind of goes to war with the country's labour movement. And this is something that previous Conservative governments had tried and failed to do. But she basically stands firmly against a year-long strike by the miners, the kind of strongest union then, and defeats them. And from that point onward, it's basically a story of kind of collapse and decline for the British labour movement, because Thatcher knows that if she wants to build this very extractive, financialised economic model, then she's going to have to go through a serious amount of opposition from the power base that is benefiting from the previous model, and that's obviously predominantly the British labour movement. So she takes on the labour movement, and again that accelerates those trends towards deindustrialisation, the loss of manufacturing jobs, and actually regional inequality. A lot of the trends that are now being talked about in this election in terms of the north-south divide didn't begin, but kind of were really properly consolidated during the 1980s. And these changes that she implements are associated with, what I call the financialisation of the British economy, the rise of finance-led growth. And I look at it in the book by taking Keynes's demand equation. So aggregate demand is consumption spending by individuals, investment by businesses, government spending, and net exports, and look at how financialisation has affected all of those different areas. So starting with businesses, you start to see businesses increasingly being run in the interests of investors, of shareholders, and of creditors, rather than workers. Now, this is associated with those changes to the stock exchange, which obviously determines how companies are owned, and also the decline of the labour movement. It basically means that there's a big redistribution of power within corporations. Shareholders, creditors, people who own the stocks and the people that lend money to the company gain much more power relative to workers. And this is associated with a big increase in the returns going to capital, the profit share of national income, the amount being distributed in dividends, mergers and acquisitions, share buybacks, etc. And a long-term decline in wage growth. Wage growth obviously has completely flatlined since the financial crisis, but it started to slow in the 1980s. And yeah, that's broadly associated with the idea of kind of the predominance of shareholder value ideology amongst corporations. Again, thinking back to that Marxist analysis, this is not probably something that you'll look at if you do economics. You know, there'll be theories about how the firm will work, theories about how investment should happen, but there won't be any analysis of the historical change in the nature of corporate governance. And you won't really look at power relations within the firm, but this is actually a really important change that is associated with, as I said, a kind of massive increase in the amount going to basically the elite and a long-term decline in the amount that goes to workers. Alongside this, you know, Keynes, when he was writing about aggregate demand, was famously trying to deal with this problem that when businesses don't invest and consumers don't consume and the government doesn't spend, you get a slowdown which kind of snowballs basically and then becomes bigger than the initial contraction in demand. That potentially means they're not going to buy the things that businesses are producing. The genius of the financialisation fix and a kind of overt strategy that Thatcher pursued was to replace wage growth with private debt. And she did that in a couple of different ways. Firstly, by deregulating the banking system, it just means it's much easier for everyone to gain access to unsecured lending, that's like credit card debt and that sort of stuff. But also, more importantly, the privatisation of social housing, the privatisation of pensions, and the demutualisation of the building societies means loads of people can get a mortgage, nearly everyone can get a mortgage, and you can buy your council house at a massive discount. What this does is effectively, this was an attempt to kind of create a class of mini capitalists. Thatcher wants responsible homeowners who are going to respect the property relations upon which capitalism is based, not challenge that, not a bunch of nasty socialists who, you know, don't respect private property, but people who own their own homes. And she does this very, very successfully. And it has two effects, obviously one of which is stabilising the system, creating that class of homeowners who are now the ones that are all voting Conservative, right? That age divide is not historically continuous. It very much emerges after the financial crisis when you get the people who benefited from that Thatcherite boom sitting on all this wealth compared to us, well, your generation and me, slightly older, who can't afford to get on the property ladder. And that is very much a remnant of that Thatcherite attempt to create that class of mini capitalists. And that also props up demand, because you've got house prices rising, people feel richer, so they go out and spend more money. Now, we all know where this ends up. The similar sort of model is pursued in the US, and accompanied by some big changes in the way that international finance works. This obviously leads to the financial crisis. And again, coming back to that Marxist analysis, each of these models that I've discussed so far, whether it's laissez-faire, the post-war consensus, finance-led growth, they're all associated with internal problems that mean they eventually stop working properly and they break down and it leads to crisis. These are not just kind of external things that happen. Again, in mainstream economics, you'll tell you that the only real reason, other than just change in the business cycle, that you get economic crises is exogenous shocks. Stuff that happens out there that makes the economy work less well. But actually, the Marxist analysis is that there are internal contradictions, problems within various different economic systems that mean that over time, eventually they stop working properly. And the contradictions associated with finance-led growth were all to do with the attempt to massively increase private debt to account for the fact that wages were falling. You actually also get a similar sort of problem with corporate debt as well, which is now a really significant issue. And where was the government in all of this? Well, obviously, you know, at this point, the British state, and still today, the British state has a very close relationship with the City of London. A huge proportion of Conservative Party donations come from firms in or linked to the city. The city has a representative, which is the only unelected representative allowed to enter the House of Commons. It's not a local authority like any other, it's actually a private corporation. Very weird setup. And the influence that the city had over the British state meant that, the state wasn't really stepping in to regulate this kind of capitalism that had emerged. It very much stepped back and said, no, we need a light touch approach to regulation, which was something that was pursued by both the Thatcher government and afterwards both Blair and Brown, who were really big fans of this idea of a light touch regulation. But actually New Labour in many ways went even further, because they introduced the logic of financialisation into the running of the state itself. And you can see this particularly clearly with the private financing initiatives, where you get private investors undertaking state spending on the state's behalf. Again, this is another way in which public debt is replaced with private debt. If you think of the rise of household debt as replacing wages with private debt, you can think of the financialisation of the state replacing public spending and government bonds with spending undertaken by outsourcing corporations, private financing initiatives that raise capital on international capital markets. And ultimately, this is obviously more expensive, it's unstable, we saw what happened to Carillion this year, and it reduces the accountability of the state towards service users and basically increases the links between private finance, industry and the upper echelons of government, and ultimately means that no one is even remotely aware or particularly cares, even if they were aware, of the massive problems that were being stored up in the British economy before 2008. So I'm I'm running out of time, so I'll just talk a little bit about what's happened since the crisis. And basically, since the financial crisis, absent that massive and continuous increase in private debt, absent that massive and continuous increase in house prices, though house prices have continued to go up quite a lot, without the kind of tax revenues that were associated with the growth of the city being redistributed in the way that they were before, in the context of austerity basically, you've seen the fundamental problems associated with this model come to the fore. So this is the decade of wage stagnation, a decade of productivity stagnation, because businesses aren't investing in production. They're too busy trying to boost their share price by buying back their own shares or dishing out dividends to their shareholders. And a lot of them have taken out huge amounts of debt not to invest in anything productive, which is putting them in a very precarious situation. It's why we're seeing a lot of corporate insolvencies at the moment. You've also got, massive increases in inequality, which have been generated by, in part by that decline in wages, in part by rising inflation, and in part by the austerity regime that's been pursued by the government to impose the costs of that bank bailout on working people up and down this country. And really what you start to see, trade deficits, housing crisis, all of these sorts of different things suggest that we are still living really in that moment of crisis, that moment between the death of the old model and the birth of the new one, similar to, say, the 1970s or the 1930s, where you have a series of kind of overlapping crises based in the economy, based in the realm of production, but which generate political crises. And you can see that with, the vote to leave the European Union. You can see that with the massive disruption in the alignment of British politics, the kind of constitutional chaos that's happened over the last several years. And the question really is kind of what comes next, because you've got all these kind of crises with British capitalism. They're set against a big set of crises for the global economy, not least the climate breakdown, which is obviously the big one, but also, there's a massive global debt bubble, 3 times the size of global GDP. You've got all the trade tensions that are potentially kind of really threatening the integrity of liberal globalization. You have probably a set of recessions in the US, the Eurozone, various other parts of the world on the horizon, and the inability of most governments to really do anything to be able to deal with that. So the question then is where next? And I think this is where we have to situate the political conjuncture we find ourselves in, because there is a widespread acceptance amongst most people in the country that there needs to be a radical break with the status quo. That's generally what happens when you get to these moments of crisis, when the old model's broken down so completely. And that can benefit the left and the right. In 2017 we saw, maybe people are starting to get more receptive to this idea of a much more socialist politics, right? Maybe this crisis will be resolved in favour of labour, in favour of working people. But more recently, and particularly as a result of Brexit, it seems like there's been a big pushback and the reconfiguration of the Conservative Party to allow itself to benefit from this crisis, even though it, was very much implicated in causing it, is something that was completely unexpected. And it may turn out that this crisis is resolved in favour of capital, basically, of the owners of the means of production. But even then, it's very hard to see how those who engineered this crisis can figure out a way out of it. Boris Johnson obviously wants to pursue this kind of, Singapore off the coast of Europe model for Britain, turn it into a tax haven / regulation, make us into an even more internationalised and financialised economy than we already are. But as we know, looking at this historically, that model leads to crises. And those crises will continue to happen if we don't change the way that the economy works. So really, the kind of fundamental point, I suppose, of the book is that we are at a really significant turning point in terms of our politics. And we are at one of those moments where, like the 1970s, like the 1930s, the class boundaries in society, the divide between people who live off work and those who live off wealth, and the fact that their interests are quite distinct, is becoming much more obvious, and that is leading to a very different kind of politics than the one that we saw throughout, say, most of the 1990s. And yeah, I mean, really, I talk a lot in the book about where we can go next, what we can do to try and make sure that this crisis is resolved in favour of Labour, with a small L. But ultimately, as with any kind of changes in the nature of capitalism, what will happen will be determined by class struggle, by whether or not working people are able to organise in order to take back control of some of those institutions and transform them in favour of Labour. At the moment, it doesn't look like we're any closer, with 5 years of Conservative rule, to a resolution of this crisis. But historically, Marxists have always said capitalism is approaching its existential crisis, the crisis from which it won't be able to recover. And every time, it always finds a way to adapt. So we'd be unwise to assume that another solution cannot be found. I will open up to questions for like half an hour if anyone has any. Take 3 at a time so we can get through some. Yeah.
What, anyone else?
Yeah, there's plenty, don't worry. Oh, do you want to start?
Oh yeah, sure. So, I was speaking to Labour members, someone who was, campaign staff during the election. I think one of the big frustrating things for me was, 2017, it kind of felt like we almost misanalyzed it. We thought what was a really good manifesto and everything, almost equated to there being this underlying support for socialist ideology as opposed to just simply policy. And then we almost kind of took that conclusion, and the 2019 manifesto obviously was what it was. And my experience on Dorset and organising campaign sessions is fundamentally have people who shout back to you, free broadband thing, and we're throwing in policies left, right and centre. And, almost in a sense, our own members are getting overwhelmed with having to suddenly explain where we're going to get £50 billion to spend on waspy women and, all these sort of things. And it was really frustrating. So how do you do you think there's actually a way to reconcile a lot of what you're saying into a message that could make an electable Labour Party?
Good question. There was someone over there, yeah.
Hi Grace, just want to say thank you for coming to York. I'm interested to understand you talk about how you are maybe wanting an economy which is away from the finance industry. What particular ideas would you have to maybe move towards the manufacturing area or something like that?
Cool. And then there was someone else in the back. There or there.
Thank you again for coming to York. My question is based upon the rise of venture capital and private equity. Do you think that the future of financialisation is away from debt but close to equity financing?
Yeah. I'll start with that last one because Yeah, quite specific. Yeah, that's been a really interesting change since the financial crisis. It's been the move away from, well, I mean, in many ways, part of the problem has been that certain corporations have become so heavily indebted that they can't really afford to borrow anymore, whether that's from banks or on bond markets. But that problem is unevenly distributed. So you have a lot of like quite highly indebted corporations that seem to be struggling quite a lot. But you've also had the emergence of a very weird economic phenomenon, which has been the massive increase in just retained corporate profits. So companies just sitting on tons and tons of cash without having anything to do with it. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that many of them are monopolies, so they deliberately restrict investment in order to boost their profits. But it's also to do with the absence of kind of viable investment opportunities. But that accompanied by continuing increases in housing wealth, and what's kind of called social security capital, so like people saving for their pensions. That basically mean there are these huge kind of pools of capital. There's an economist called Hyman Minsky that refers to this as the rise of these big pools of capital as the dawn of money manager capitalism. And these obviously big pools of capital have to be managed. So most of them are managed by your pension, for example. You will send it to a pension fund, and that pension fund will send it to an asset manager like BlackRock. And it will make a whole series of decisions about where that capital goes. But also you have more kind of nimble and smaller players in that game, VC and private equity, for example, people who have tons of money and are able to, say, buy up entire companies, private equity, strip it out and sell it off for a profit, or venture capital, people who are able to kind of find and provide startup funding for, entrepreneurs. All of these changes rest on basically the massive accumulation of wealth at the very top of the economy, and the ability of a certain number of people to basically invest that how they like. I would say, VC and private equity is slightly different because they rest on a kind of the people who do this are insiders. They have a unique access to knowledge, and they're generally pretty good at being able to kind of look at opportunities. The wider problem for this form of money manager capitalism is a lack of investment opportunities. So unless you're really good at finding the next amazing Mark Zuckerberg, there is increasingly not enough demand in the global economy, not enough going on, particularly in the global north, to allow people to make returns on their investment. This is a big problem for pension funds, say, that aren't able to kind of generate the returns that they once did. So yeah, we are definitely seeing a move from, say, banking and lending towards wealth management, but that is creating its own sorts of problems, I think, particularly amongst the kind of bigger pools of capital, big investors. Ideas, I'll just go in reverse order. Yeah, so in the last chapter of my book, I talk a little bit about some ideas, not to literally build socialism, but basically to shift power between capital and labour. The idea being that you don't build socialism overnight, you build up the power of working people, and then they are able to demand that themselves through organising and through making demands of the state. So the ideas I have are to shift power between those two classes. And one of the ways I think we can do that is by starting with the problem, so starting with finance and talking about socialising the finance sector. One of the ideas, one of my favourite ideas in the book actually, is this idea of a people's asset manager. So what I was just saying about you send your pension to a pension fund, they send it to BlackRock, and BlackRock then maybe invests in the company that you work in and says you need to cut wages. Why not have a publicly owned and democratically run asset manager that could invest strategically in sectors of the economy to boost wages, make the economy more sustainable in terms of the environment, and also generate a return that could be handed back to workers. And by doing that, you would basically be shifting ownership in the economy, because ultimately this thing would be investing our money into companies that we would then collectively own and could influence. So it's stuff like that, and there's also all sorts of things in the book. The idea of a Green New Deal. I have an idea of a public retail banking system, of a big private debt write-off that could help the economy. It's all in the last chapter of the book. So political question. I'm still in the midst of thinking about what happened myself. Obviously, I was also on the doorstep quite a lot. I think I had the dubious honour of going to pretty much all the seats that we lost in the Midlands and the North. It wasn't actually that much of a surprise to me what happened on election day because of, as you said, speaking to people. I think there were a lot of different problems. The Brexit position didn't help. Several years of media onslaught towards Corbyn meant that he was much more unpopular in 2019 than he was in 2017. Brexit didn't help with that either. But there were issues, I think, around broadly speaking, individually, a lot of the policies are very, very popular. Nationalising the railways, the Green New Deal, these things are very popular individually. But the way that they were put into this manifesto, as you said, I think we were fighting the last battle. We thought, oh, we've won all those arguments from 2017, so we can just scattergun a million different policies into the electorate and presume that that will work. And obviously it didn't. There was the absence of a coherent message. And I think really, a big problem was also an absence of leadership. And that kind of partly came from Jeremy, I think, partly from the kind of umming and ahhing about Brexit, but it was a lot to do with the people around him and the people in the Labour Party. And again, you had a question about whether or not this analysis links up with what's going on in the Labour Party. Historically, British Marxists have not been particularly, not spoken particularly favourably about the Labour Party, because, it seemed, for most of British history, well, I mean, particularly since the 1990s, that you were never going to get the kind of politics and policies that they were advocating through the Labour Party. It was never going to be a vehicle for class struggle. That seems to have changed, right? But it is an open question as to whether or not it goes back. I think the fact that it is now a mass party again, the fact that you've got hundreds of thousands of members, more than 500,000 now, in that party, massively shifts the balance of power there. But really, I don't think we can do anything without the presence of organised labour and of the labour movement. That, I think, really should be something that socialists should focus on over the next 5 years, is trying to rebuild the labour movement and trying to unionise in sectors that don't currently have access to, bargaining rights, the gig economy, those who are precariously employed, people who are employed in retail, because that's really, I think, how you build up class consciousness from the ground up. Right, I'll take a couple more. I'm going to try and get a good spread. And some women, preferably as well. Okay, I'll find one later. Right, so I had one there, and one there. I'll come to you in a bit.
I was wondering what you make of the proposal made by groups such as Positive Money to take power to put money away from banks, and probably briefly explain how that actually works, because it's kind of mind-boggling to ordinary people how that actually works.
Oh, and so there was some,
What do you think New Labour's role was in furthering financialisation or curbing financialisation, and how do they, by moving forward, what policies can they introduce to actually curb it?
And then gentlemen over there.
So you mentioned this crisis of over-accumulation, where investors are sitting on massive pools of resources and have no idea what to do with it. Might another alternative be an emergence of a new structure of capital accumulation that profits from repression? So like a convergence between capital accumulation and militarized repression that profits from mass surveillance, mass incarceration, and so on.
I'll start with that one again. Yes. From the sounds of it, this seems like this is probably something you've thought of a bit more than I have. But I mean, it's certainly, whenever I talk about this and people say, what would the next phase of adaptation look like? What always comes up is, the big tech giants, digitization, automation, but also, that idea of surveillance capitalism and what that involves. I suppose if you combine that with the acknowledgement that we are in a global climate crisis and that there is going to be a huge amount of money put into the militarization of borders and the kind of repression of the movement of people, then that amounts to, quite a scary thought. And I mean, I suppose it's analogous to if a lot of where the profit is coming from now. If we're in a stage of monopoly capitalism and a lot of the profit that is generated in the economy is generated from rents, then I suppose it would be analogous to a kind of neo-feudalism, right, where the privileges and the ability of those at the top to extract wealth is protected not just by the kind of, you know, discursive and institutional forms of dominance that we see at the moment, but actually by overt force, as it is really in most parts of the global south. Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely, if not a possibility, I mean, it's already really here with the politics of people like Trump and to an extent Boris Johnson. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a scary thing to look out for if we don't organise. I am really an optimist. Yeah, so the role of New Labour is an interesting one. It's very difficult to have this conversation without it becoming very like, why do you think Tony Blair was evil? And it's really not, that's not really what it's about. It's about analysing the structures of the economy and the way that politicians respond to those. So, you know, you can hear from Mandelson and Campbell their analysis of the situation, which basically we were picking up where Thatcher left off. And I'm sure Blair did actually think he was doing that because, you know, his whole idea was class is no longer as politically significant. The Labour Party needs to adapt to the realities of globalisation. We need to adapt to the realities of a modern service-based economy. All of that is very much Thatcher's rhetoric. I'm sure he did that because he thought that was the best way to help, at that point, working people, right? And, you know, New Labour did have the minimum wage. They did increase spending on things like the NHS, Sure Start centres, all of those sorts of things that are cited by Blair's fans. They obviously did happen. The issue is that the way that was done left all the structures that were created by Thatcherism basically unchallenged. And that was often explicitly for the reason that, you know, in the book I talk about Blair and Brown's relationship with the city and how they did really think that if the city boomed, that would generate revenues which they would be able to spend in the north, right? There wasn't even the thought that perhaps the City of London was in many ways implicated in the deindustrialisation that had harmed those regions of the country in the first place. And I think partly that has to do with, you know, partly that is an individual characteristic of them, partly that's to do with the state of discourse and academia at the time. So at the time, you know, it was after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, it was the end of history, there was this widespread assumption in most academic disciplines that Marxism was basically irrelevant, you know, that even progressives had moved on to things like post-structuralism, and neoclassical economics was very much dominant, so there was that justification for it. And there was also the fact that the Labour Party had really ceased to be a mass party, so it was fairly easy to push into a new direction because there wasn't this big membership, and the unions had obviously been drastically curtailed. Having said that, I do think there are things that they could have done, even in those quite constrained circumstances. I think the real issue, you know, because I think, you know, I can look back and think I understand why Blair did X, Y, and Z. But I think one of the biggest things for the Labour Party, for a party that was founded by unions, is that New Labour did not remove any of the anti-union legislation that was implemented by Thatcher, which has, you know, continued to kind of harm the Labour movement in the UK to this day, as well as all the stuff around, you know, the way they regulated the city, which was completely and utterly inadequate, and you know, the way they kind of unrelentingly embraced globalisation in its kind of economic guise, which has obviously kind of accelerated many of the problems that I've been talking about. So yeah, you know, it's understandable the position that New Labour adopted, and indeed it was adopted by most centre-left centre-left parties around the global north, but New Labour was quite an extreme version of that, and yeah, I think that there was more that could have been done from a left government at that point to mitigate the impact of financialisation. And yeah, this question about creating money. So yeah, this organisation called Positive Money was set up by fans of a theory called modern monetary theory, which basically looks at the way that a theory of the financial system and a theory of money. And one of the things that it looks at is the way that the private banks are able to create money. So as a private bank, I can lend you money without you first depositing money in my bank, right? The standard theory of banking is that it intermediates between savers and borrowers. So I'm a saver, I put my money in the bank then takes that money and lends it out to someone else. And he says, no, that's not how banking works. Banks can actually create money out of thin air, basically, because the government gives them the right to do so, which is true. Now, the Bank of England now has said, yes, this is actually how banking does work. And there are a lot of responses to this. So, for example, you might have heard of the idea of like green quantitative easing, which is the idea that you take the money from quantitative easing and use it to invest in the economy. Another one is that we basically say that banks can't create money anymore. They do have to become intermediaries between savers and borrowers. So as a bank, I can't lend you £10 if someone hasn't already given me £10 of their savings. Now, I'm not really sure about that one, because what debt allows us to do, I mean, debt it's not a neutral tool, but it has its advantages irrespective of kind of the way in which it's used. So at the moment, it's obviously used as a way to exploit and oppress working people, but it, potentially could be, basically what debt allows you to do is take value out of the future and bring it to today. If you can borrow money against future growth, that allows you to basically bring that growth into being. So if you borrow money for infrastructure investment, you can do things like the Green New Deal, right? That would be impossible without borrowing, a lot of which would be public, but some of it which would be private. So I think there are a lot of interesting areas of MMT, but I personally wouldn't go down that route. But yeah. Right, I'll take one more round and then I have to go. So you, down in the front, and lady at the back.
What impact do you think leaving the EU will have on power relations between workers and capital?
Good question.
This is probably a very naive and wrong-headed question. I'm not an economist or a political scientist or have any special knowledge about this, but it seems to me that in democracies, something has, looking at the grand sweep of history, sustained inequality. So, elections come and go, and we wring our hands and tear our hair out every time that equality doesn't seem to, win the votes required to make real change. So is it that the ruling class is just incredibly clever at keeping sort of one step ahead and sort of hoodwinking the masses in some curious way, or is there some kind of game theoretic analysis that predicts that somehow the equilibrium is always going to be quite a high level of inequality? No, what is it?
Hi, thank you very much. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about the Green New Deal and sort of how you think that translates across into Britain, and particularly the idea of degrowth, because you talk a lot about sort of capitalism and perpetual growth, and sort of what you see as a sort of market's understanding of degrowth.
Okay, so I'll try and go through these quite quickly. Leaving the EU, leaving the EU, the EU in many ways, especially since the idea of the social Europe has had a kind of dual character. So on the one hand, it is a club created by international capital with the help of capitalist states to remove barriers to trade, harmonise regulation, remove restrictions on capital mobility, create kind of a much more, remove restrictions to the integration of financial markets, all of these sorts of things that, broadly speaking, do increase the power of capital relative to labour. But it has also shifted slightly because of, arguably, the presence of a relatively well-organised European working class, definitely not because of the presence of a well-organised British working class. So, as a result of that, you've had some concessions on things like labour rights, environmental standards, all those sorts of things. So I think the way in which Brexit is managed determines what wins out. The Tories want to leave because of that second set of issues, right? They don't want to be constrained by European regulation. They want to chart their own course and turn us into a tax haven off the coast of Europe. A lot of people who supported like a left-wing case for leaving the EU, including myself, thought that there were certain elements of European regulation, particularly around capital mobility and and government spending that could have constrained a socialist project. But that second set of things only applies if you have a Labour government and if you have an organised working class and an organised labour movement, which we don't at the moment. In that context, I think leaving the EU under Boris Johnson can only serve to kind of accelerate the assault on working people in this country. And that was really what, it could have been a bigger theme of Labour's election strategy, which is to say that, no matter what you think about leaving the European Union, no one voted for, literally turning us into a tax haven off the coast of Europe that's going to do a trade deal with America, and Trump is undoubtedly going to demand market access to lots of public institutions, including the NHS, and also demands for certain for US pharmaceutical companies. So, I think it's contingent, and how it plays out will be determined by class struggle again. And I don't think we're well organised enough really to be able to resist the plans that Johnson and the ERG have, which I do not think are good. Having said that, those plans are also potentially likely to blow up in their face, because we are on the tipping point of another economic crisis, and that could realise itself as a result of this, of a hard Brexit. So that's an interesting question. What is sustaining inequality? I mean, there have been very different levels of inequality depending on the kind of architecture of the system that you're looking at. So in the UK, the post-war period, much lower levels of inequality. Even if you look around Europe now, there are obviously capitalist countries that have much lower levels of inequality. And again, I think that is basically determined by the balance of power between capital and labour. It's determined by property relations. And in those Nordic countries where there is more equality, you have much stronger labour movement. You have a state that's much more responsive to organised labour and much less responsive to kind of organised international capital. You can say the same about the UK in the post-war period. So really, I don't think there's capitalism creates an inherent tendency towards inequality, because there are some people who own all the stuff and generate profit from that, and there are a vast majority of people who are forced to sell their labour for a living, and they get less than what they deserve for the use of their labour power. So there is that natural tendency towards it, but it can be mitigated by different institutional regimes, and I think it has been throughout history, and there's no reason that it couldn't be again. And the Green New Deal, I think this is one of those things that could do quite a lot to, even within the boundaries of capitalism, shift power between those two groups, and also deal with that big existential crisis that we all face, which is climate breakdown. Because, what you would really be looking at is a massive marshalling of collective resources on a scale that hasn't been seen really since the Second World War. You would have to see, really, if you look at the first New Deal, for example, there are estimates that at its peak was worth around 30% of GDP. A kind of stimulus program of that scale in the UK today would be absolutely enormous, like nothing we've ever experienced in our lifetimes. It would basically mean the state marshalling its power to direct, coordinate production, to build, clean energy, to green our infrastructure, our transport infrastructure, to change the way that production takes place, to change maybe some of our eating habits, all these sorts of things. In doing so, it would create jobs, it would boost investment, and it would take some power away from the people who currently dominate production and hand it back to the state. The question as to whether or not that ends up boosting workers' power as opposed to just state power is an open one, right? And I think a big set of demands around what the Green New Deal looks like has to be that those investment programs and public institutions that work to do some of this investment are democratized. So, if we nationalise the railways and then make them all electric, how are those services going to be run? How are those decisions going to be made? There was a lot of work that was being done before the election looking at how you build democratic public services and you do democratic public ownership, which is, I think, has to be a really key part of that. Sadly, obviously, that's not going to happen, but obviously we can look over to the US as potentially, you know, a source of hopefully optimism, depending on what happens over the next couple of months, because there is a really, I think, big and quite powerful coalition there for a Green New Deal that, in terms of its impact on the environment, if it was done in the US, would obviously be masses of times bigger than what would happen here. I will stop there. Perfectly on time, so I have to go. But thank you everyone very much.
So first of all, I'd like to thank Grace for coming all the way up here for the fascinating talk. I'd like to thank the Economics Department for helping us put this on, and of course all the other volunteers in the York Union. To put on these events takes a lot of time, and it does cost money as well, so we can't... Oh, and the media man at the back. So we ask for a £2 donation from students and a £4 donation from non-students if you can afford it. Thank you very much, guys.
Sorry, I can't stay. Thanks, guys.
Johnny, getting home. Oh, she came. Oh wait, you did hear me saying that. I want to keep this recording in there.
Oh no.